On March 19th, 1919, the entire city of New Orleans erupted in music. Jazz poured from every window, every doorway, every street corner. But this wasn't celebration. This was survival, because 3 days earlier, a killer had sent them a letter and made them an offer they couldn't refuse. Welcome to Chalk and Silence, where we uncover the real stories that slip through the cracks of history, the mysteries that textbooks forget, the cases that refuse to stay buried. If you're drawn to the shadows where truth meets the unexplained, subscribe and join us as we explore what really happened when the cameras stopped rolling and the headlines faded. New Orleans, 1918. The air was thick with more than just Louisiana humidity. The Great War was bleeding the city dry, filling its ports with wounded soldiers and its streets with widows. Then came the Spanish flu, creeping through the crowded neighborhoods like fog off the Mississippi. By autumn, schools were shuttered, churches locked, theaters dark. People stayed home, doors bolted, windows sealed. But home wasn't safe anymore. On the night of May 22nd, Joseph and Catherine Maggio were asleep in their apartment above their grocery store. Corner of Upper Line and Magnolia, the kind of mom-and-pop shop that anchored every New Orleans neighborhood. Joseph was Italian, like so many of the small business owners who'd made this city their American dream. The dream ended at 3 a.m. Someone had chiseled out a panel in their back door. Neat, precise work. Professional. They slipped inside like smoke, carrying a straight razor. Catherine's throat was cut so deep her head nearly came off. Joseph's wasn't much better, but the killer wasn't finished. He grabbed the couple's own axe from their shed and went to work on their skulls. Joseph's brothers found them the next morning. Joseph was still breathing, but barely. He died minutes later, never knowing who had destroyed his life. The killer had changed clothes at the scene, left his bloody garments behind, and walked out in Joseph's clean shirt. Money sat untouched on the counter. This wasn't robbery. This was something else entirely. 1 month later, the killer struck again. Louis Bessumer, another grocer, another Italian immigrant, another family business. The pattern was forming, but the police couldn't see it yet. Or maybe they didn't want to. Bessumer survived. Barely. His companion, Harriet Lowe, wasn't so lucky. She lived long enough to point the finger at Bessumer himself, claiming he was a German spy, claiming he was the one who'd tried to kill her. The police arrested him. The real killer watched from the shadows as innocent men got dragged away in chains. August brought 2 more attacks. Anna Schneider, 8 months pregnant, woke to find a dark figure standing over her bed. She wasn't Italian. She wasn't a grocer. But she was vulnerable, alone, and the killer was adapting. He beat her face in with a lamp, left her bleeding on her bedroom floor. Somehow, she survived. Gave birth 2 days later to a healthy baby girl. Then came Joseph Romano. His nieces heard the commotion, rushed to his room, and saw something no one else had seen. The killer himself. Dark-skinned, heavy-set, wearing a slouched hat. He was already running, disappearing into the New Orleans night like he'd never existed at all. Romano died 2 days later. The city was in full panic mode. 7 months of silence. 7 months of people sleeping with axes under their beds, of Italian families hiring guards, of a city holding its breath. Then March 1919 arrived, and with it, a new level of horror. The Cortimiglia family lived across the river in Gretna. Charles ran a small grocery, just like the others. On March 10th, the killer paid them a visit. When neighbors found the scene, Charles was unconscious. Rosie was barely breathing, and their 2-year-old daughter, Mary, was dead. A toddler. The killer had graduated to murdering children. But this time, the authorities had suspects. The Jordanos, an old man and his teenage son who lived next door. Never mind that frail old Orlando could barely lift a coffee cup, let alone swing an axe. Never mind that there was zero evidence. The police needed someone to blame, and the Jordanos were convenient. They coerced a confession out of the grieving mother, threatened her, held her as a material witness until she signed a statement naming the neighbors. Orlando got life in prison. His son Frank got a date with the electric chair. 3 days after the Gretna attack, an envelope arrived at the Times-Picayune newspaper. No return address. The letter inside changed everything. They have never caught me, and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axeman. The killer was talking. After months of silent butchery, he was finally ready to introduce himself. But he wasn't done. Now, to be exact, at 12:15 earthly time on next Tuesday night, I am going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I am going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. He was giving them a way out. Play jazz, live, stay quiet, die. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it out on that specific Tuesday night will get the axe. March 19th, 1919, the ultimatum night. New Orleans faced a choice: call the killer's bluff or dance to his tune. They chose music. Every dance hall in the city was packed. Every bar, every club, every social hall. People who'd never touched an instrument bought harmonicas, borrowed guitars, cranked their phonographs to maximum volume. The wealthy hired full bands. The poor made do with singing. From the French Quarter to the Garden District, from uptown to the Bywater, New Orleans became one massive jazz session. Saxophones wailed from shotgun houses. Trumpets blared from mansion balconies. Piano rolled like thunder through the humid night air. The killer had turned the entire city into his personal orchestra. And it worked. No murders that night. Not one. The Axeman had kept his word, or at least that's how it seemed. In reality, he'd done something far more sinister. He'd proven he could control them. An entire city dancing to his rhythm. Local composer Joseph John de Villa captured the moment in a song, The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz, Don't Scare Me, Papa. The killer had become entertainment. Terror transformed into art. The Axeman wasn't finished. 3 more attacks followed that summer and fall. Steve Boca in August, beaten with his own axe, but surviving. Sarah Lauman in September, a 19-year-old girl who woke up to find her skull caved in, but lived to tell no tale, her memory wiped clean by trauma. Then came the finale. October 27th, 1919. Mike Pepitone, another Italian grocer, another family man. His wife Esther was there when it happened. She saw the killer's shadow moving through their bedroom, heard the axe coming down again and again. But when the police arrived, she couldn't describe the man who'd murdered her husband. After that, silence. The real kind. The Axeman vanished as suddenly as he'd appeared, leaving behind 11 victims, a city traumatized, and a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. Well, almost unsolved. 2 years later, in Los Angeles, a woman named Esther Pepitone allegedly came face to face with her husband's killer. The man's name was Joseph Momfre, a known criminal from New Orleans who ran a Black Hand extortion racket targeting Italian businesses. When he confronted Esther, demanding money and threatening to kill her the same way he'd killed Mike, she pulled out a revolver and shot him dead. At least that's the story. The problem is there are no records. No police reports, no court documents, no newspaper articles. Nothing to prove Joseph Momfre existed, let alone that he died in Los Angeles in 1921. Crime researcher Michael Newton spent years searching for evidence and found nothing. The story of Momfre might be the most persistent urban legend in true crime history. It's too perfect, too neat. The grieving widow getting her revenge, the villain confessing before he dies, justice served at last. Real life rarely ties up loose ends so cleanly. But here's what we do know. A man named Momfre was connected to a 1912 shooting of Italian grocers in New Orleans. The same case where police found a cryptic message. Mrs. Maggio is going to sit up tonight just like Mrs. Tony. Tony being the nickname for the woman killed in 1912, 6 years before the Axeman's first official victim. Was Joseph Momfre the Axeman? Was he killed by Mike Pepitoni's widow? Or is this just another ghost story from a city that specializes in them? The truth is, we may never know who the Axeman really was. Some believe he was a lone psychopath with a racial vendetta against Italian immigrants. Others think he was a mafia enforcer, though his methods, leaving survivors and attacking women and children, were unlike typical organized crime hits. There's even a theory that the famous jazz letter was a hoax, written by someone trying to promote the music scene, though that doesn't explain away the very real murders that preceded and followed it. What we know for certain is this. Between 1918 and 1919, someone stalked the Italian grocers of New Orleans with an axe. Someone who could slip through locked doors like smoke, who killed with tools found at the scene, who vanished without leaving a fingerprint or a witness who lived to give a clear description. Someone who understood that the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones that roar. They're the ones that whisper, the ones that make you dance. The Axeman of New Orleans represents something uniquely American, a killer who exploited not just individual victims, but an entire community's fears and prejudices. He turned a city's racism against itself, used the media to spread terror, and disappeared into legend before anyone could stop him. His story reminds us that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who understand their prey better than their prey understands itself. The ones who know exactly which buttons to push, which fears to exploit, which songs to make us dance to. The jazz stopped playing eventually, but in New Orleans, if you listen carefully on certain nights, when the wind carries just right across the Mississippi, some say you can still hear the echo of that music, still hear the sound of an entire city dancing to a killer's tune. What do you think happened to the Axeman? Was Joseph Momfre the man behind the mask, or is the truth still out there, waiting to be discovered? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to explore more mysteries that refuse to stay buried, check out our video on The Boy in the Box. Subscribe for more real stories from the shadows of history. Until next time, stay curious.